and welcome to the second part of this week's reading vlog. So I managed to complete the little challenge I set for myself of reading a book before midday. So now me and B are going to take a lunch break, but afterwards I'm going to dive into Hole in the Middle by Kendra Fortmeyer. Now, this is a book that B definitely gave 5 stars. She loved it. I'm hoping that it'll be less heavy, but I think I read the first chapter of this a while ago and really gelled with it already, so I have no doubts that I will like it equally as much. I managed to read 70 pages before our break for lunch, and I have to admit that I'm really enjoying this one too. It feels like it's going to be a good day of reading with only good choices. This is the story of Ingrid, who has found herself in a wilderness camp, thinking that it was some kind of retreat with log cabins and mess halls, but instead it's actual, proper camping. And even more surprisingly, she's with a bunch of teen convicts and addicts and just people that have had a really rough time in life and are looking for a new start, and this is how they're going to do that, cleanse their minds. Isn't what she was thinking it was going to be. So she's writing letters to her mum, who's an opera singer and has recently lost her voice, ruined her career, and I don't know whether we're ever going to get a reply from her mum. This is told in 2 narratives at once, so you have the past where Ingrid is telling you how she got to this point, and then also her time at the camp. And I wonder what her character development is going to be like. We've already had the title, Everything Beautiful Is Not Ruined, and I wonder how that is going to apply to Ingrid's life as well as her mum's. So I've got to 186, which is essentially the halfway point of Hole in the Middle, and unfortunately I'm not liking it as much as I thought I would in my last clip. The first chapter was really fun. It gave you such a flavour for the character's voice. It's very witty and referential. Maddie from the future here to say that one of my clips got deleted where I was talking about the beginning of Hole in the Middle. The main character Morgan has a hole in her lower abdomen and she's hidden it her whole life. Only her doctor has seen it, and although her best friend knows about it, it's not really something that she's comfortable talking about. Then she decides, what the heck, I'm just going to embrace my body as the way it is, go to a club, cut my t-shirt into a crop top so people can see the hole and just deal with the reactions, because ultimately that's going to help her gain some body positivity. Then people see the hole, become fascinated by it, it becomes an internet phenomenon, also having to deal with the negative side of social media where people feel that they have the right to comment on her body. But now, because of her internet fame, another doctor contacts her doctor saying that she is treating a patient with a protrusion in his stomach around the same place as Morgan's hole, and thinks that they're puzzle pieces and that through some stem cell research they'll be able to discover why they're both the way they are and hopefully cure each other. So it takes 100 pages to get to the focus of the story, which I hope will be this relationship between Morgan and Howard. I finished my book and I'd have to say I'm going to give it 4 stars. It was tragic, but in such an intriguing way. I loved how the story gently unfolded and the true purpose of the letters is revealed. Ingrid says that she's going to the camp because if she does, then her mother will let her go to this fancy school in London. And when I found that out, I remember thinking like, well, why would she want to go there? And then obviously at the end you realise it's because it's like a whole new start. This is probably the best book that I've seen deal with a depressive parent. I've read a couple of depressed protagonists, but to see how her mother's depression impacted her own life felt like an important side of the story to be told, just because I've seen it from the first person perspective, but to see it from the surrounding family is just as eye-opening. I really liked Ingrid's voice in this. I like what she learned when she was on the wilderness retreat as well, to be resilient and strong, and I feel like her time there, she made the best of it. Like, she wasn't just whinging and moaning about how it was different to her expectations the whole time. There was a point where she was like, well, I'm here, so I'll just stick it out, because turns out she'd been through a lot worse before she got to the wilderness camp. I don't know how I feel about the romantic ending with Isaac. That feels like a stretch to me, but I suppose with good communication, maybe it's worth a second chance. I think it's left open enough that you can decide whether it works out or not. So I am very pleased to have read this one. It feels like exactly my wheelhouse because it's slightly mournful, it's very deep, and the narrator has a sense of humour and brings a lightness to even the dark times. I don't think it quite makes it to the favourite shelf, but it's very close to it. Now finished with Hole in the Middle, and my favourite bit was when she read fanfiction about herself. So they start doing more testing and it turns out that it's actually working on Morgan. It's shrinking the hole, but nothing is affecting Howie's condition. And so she realizes that she actually doesn't want to actively change herself. Like, so many people on the internet have taken it on board as like the ultimate self-acceptance, and they're using it as a way to process their own issues, that it's become kind of a movement. I don't know, I feel like it didn't do as much as I wanted it to. There was an excellent scene about consent and going back and having a conversation with someone that you've had a bad experience with. So I really appreciated that. But I feel like the love aspect of the story kind of came out of nowhere nowhere. Like, even though the internet was saying, oh, they should be together because they're meant to be, it's like a switch flipped in Morgan's brain, and she was like, oh yeah, I believe that too. Like, we didn't actually get to see them organically getting to know each other besides one trip to Howie's parents' house. And then it kind of culminates in them going on a road trip to see this woman who had angel wings, and she's like in her 90s now, but she tells them about like what it was like having that kind of non-normative thing about her and how she didn't let it affect her life. So that's an important lesson for them to learn as well. Generally quite a fun story, but with a lot less impact than the book I read at the beginning of the day. So Far From the Tree is definitely my favourite so far of the Bees books I've read recently. Next, I read That's Not What Happened by Kody Keplinger. This is the story of the survivors of a school shooting 3 years after it happened, and one of the girls, Leanne, deciding that it is finally time for the true story to come out. The fake story that's been going around is that Sarah, Leanne's best friend, who died in the attack, was holding on to a cross necklace and proclaiming her faith to the shooter. Since she's been hailed as a martyr and as like a cause for teens to reconfirm their faith, and Sarah's parents are about to release a book talking about Sarah's devotion and what happened to her. This is really getting under Leanne's skin, and she feels like, no, she needs to say whose necklace it really was. What I don't understand about this book was the point and the timing, because if it was that important, then it probably should have been said way sooner, because they have had 3 years to settle with the idea of Sarah being this martyr character, and the very idea of the other girl who was at the scene being the person that actually said those things. She doesn't have the image that suits that kind of action, and that's why she wasn't believed at the time. Leanne's testimony is meant to give it more weight, but then we've got another girl who was also a survivor called Ashley, who believes that it was Sarah, and she's written that it was Sarah. So it's kind of like Leanne's word against Ashley's, against who actually did it. And I don't really know what it changes very much. Like, if anything, it just takes away from Sarah and the memory that her parents have that is what's helping them cope with the whole situation. So if anything, the motive seems a little bit vindictive, especially when the girl who actually said those things has moved on. She lives in a different town. She's just trying to start a new life. So she also gains nothing by people believing her in this sense, apart from, I guess, like morally righting some wrongs that she's lived with. But it feels like they're all a little bit older than Leanne, the main character, so they're probably not as hung up on it. The whole main drive behind this plot really did lose me, but what kept me reading was the writing style. As well as trying to tell her side of the story, Leanne is trying to give a bigger picture to those who were victims of the attack, but it just further illustrated how much that tragedy had affected just so many people. Besides it being very well structured, I think the representation in this book is what made me enjoy it even more, and that's probably what I want to talk about the most, because Leanne is an asexual main character. Just like with Loveless, I thought I would talk you through some of my favourite quotes and scenes that all relate to her asexuality, because that was honestly what I was most invested in throughout. Leanne is talking about her and Sarah, and how Sarah had a boyfriend at the time and what her thoughts on that are. So she's saying, the way she talked about him, the way I heard older girls talk about their boyfriends and girlfriends, it never clicked for me. I've had crushes. There are boys I've had romantic feelings for, but I've never had any desire to do more than hold hands, or maybe kiss. It's not that I find the idea of sex repulsive. I don't actually. In some ways I find it intriguing. I've just never met or seen anyone I had any desire or even a fleeting fantasy of doing it with. Not even any of those ridiculous attractive celebrities. I recognise that they're aesthetically pleasing, but I'm also not daydreaming about ripping their clothes off. I thought that was all really well explained, that she is not sex repulsed. I really liked how she was able to separate her attraction to people on an aesthetic basis, because there are so many ways that you can be attracted to someone besides being sexually attracted to them. And I thought there was just like so much clarity in that whole paragraph that it was like, yep, no way you could misunderstand what Leanne is saying about herself. Her asexuality comes up as a plot point because Miles, one of the other survivors, and like her long-term best friend, has feelings for her. Miles is a really great character and the perfect example of someone who is not willing to push Leanne's boundaries just for his own gain. He was entirely respectful of her the whole time, which I genuinely appreciated. And Leanne has to consider whether she wants anything more from Miles. So she says, I knew he had feelings for me, and if I'm being honest, I had feelings for him too, but I decided a while ago that I wasn't going to act on them, not just because I was asexual, though that was definitely part of it. I think it might be fair to categorise Leanne as a demisexual character, because she can start to have these feelings towards Miles more romantically because she has a pre-existing relationship with him. I think it's devastatingly sad that she considers her asexuality as a reason not to be with him, like as an issue, a problem. And thank goodness that Miles is the way he is and tries to get her to reframe her asexuality as not a big deal. But it touches on something about the asexual experience, which is very common, and that's that guilt is a huge part of any relationship taken into between an asexual person and an allisexual. It feels like you're responsible for depriving them of something. So whilst it's sad that that is a factor for Leanne getting into a relationship, I'm completely sympathetic to why she thinks that that would be the issue. Because of how much sex and relationships are placed on a pedestal in our society, that it should be something that everyone is trying to reach for, the very idea of existing in a relationship that is asexual feels like you're missing out on something. So that revelation about her asexuality happens around the 100-page mark. Now we're at 200 pages where she tells Miles. The necessary context too before this scene is that Miles is asking Leanne to go to the prom with him. Miles, I'm asexual. There was a silence in the truck at first, which I guess was to be expected. When I finally worked up the courage to look at him, he was staring at me. He didn't look disgusted or annoyed. I hadn't expected him to. That wasn't Miles at all. But deep down, I think I'd still feared it. Instead, he just looked confused. I think whenever you're coming out to someone, regardless of what your sexual identity is, there's always going to be that part in your brain that thinks the worst of who you're telling. No matter how much you know that person and know that they love and accept you, even without knowing that part of you, there's something about Leanne admitting that there's still a fear there that felt super relatable. He's like, asexual? She says, somewhere on that spectrum. It's not that I'm repulsed by sex. I'm not. Ideally, I'd love to find someone I want to sleep with one day, but... Okay, think of it like when you open the fridge because you're hungry but nothing is appealing. You don't have anything against eating, you'd like to eat at some point, but you can't imagine eating anything you see in that fridge. Fantastic metaphor. She further reiterates, I've had crushes, but they've all been emotional, not physical. I've never felt that kind of sexual attraction. And then she admits that she has never felt that kind of attraction to Miles either. He's taking it very well. She apologizes and he says, don't. That's not something you have to apologize for. It's cool. Excellent response from Miles. Perfect. Although it is often a default for apologizing for not feeling a certain way about somebody, I think he takes it absolutely the best way he possibly could and doesn't make her feel awkward for just living her truth. Also, the reasons that Leanne doesn't think she can be with Miles are completely self-projecting things that she thinks he will think about the relationship. Like what I was saying earlier about feeling like something is missing on his side. They have a further conversation where she has agreed to go to prom with him and that they'll go as friends. And he says, do you like me? You can be honest. You said you still have crushes. Am I one of them? She says, of course you are, but that doesn't matter. Do you really want a girlfriend who might never want to sleep with you? He shrugged. Hadn't really thought about it before. Leanne is expecting just a blanket no and rejection. And I understand why she's like stealing her heart ready for that. Because in the end, there are equally important things in a relationship rather than just sex. But Miles writes her a letter proclaiming his love for her and that he really wants to give them a go to try and make it work because they've got such a strong friendship foundation to their relationship. And I was really pleased with that outcome and how it will affect how Lee considers her asexuality, rather than viewing it as a hindrance, just accepting it as part of herself and not something that she ever has to compromise on. So although the plot could seem quite contrived, I think the asexual representation and also the representation of a disabled character, because Denny, one of the other survivors, is legally blind, and that's something that's own voice as representation and has come up recurringly in Kody Keplinger's work, makes this a really worthy read if you're looking for a book with a diverse cast of characters.
So I managed to read another book in one sitting, and that was The Strange and Beautiful Sorrows of Ava Lavender by Leslye Walton. It worked really well actually to read in one go because there's not a lot of linear plot. It's mostly just describing the ancestors of Ava Lavender, and because of that it's really difficult to explain what exactly this book is about. So Ava Lavender is born with wings, and in her narrative there's a young boy who wants to go into the church who becomes sort of obsessed with her and thinks that she's some kind of sign from the heavens that this is what he should be doing. It kind of reminds me of Chocolat, the story about the mother and daughter who travel with the winds and set up chocolate shops because Ava's grandmother has a bakery and that changes the opinion of the town. It's very whimsical and strange, but in a way where I was like, I couldn't put it down. The more details we got about the different ancestors, the more I was like, okay, so when are we going to get to Ava? Like, she's the titular character, but it's important to see the threads of those women's lives and how that will affect Ava. I think it's just one of those books that if you want to know what happens, then you just have to read it. It's very different, is what I'll say, to like a lot of the things that I read, because it's in third person, it's like a sprawling narrative of histories, and it doesn't have like a clear act structure or anything like that. So I'm gonna give this one 3 stars. And I have another Leslye Walton book downstairs, so I'm really interested to see what the writing style of that is going to be like, because this one was very omniscient and quite lyrical. It felt like a fable. It was like a fairy tale in some senses. That's just another book off my TBR. Probably the one I've had for the longest time as well. Last night I picked up Easy Prey by Catherine Lowe, and I got about 100 pages through. So this is a book that we got at Yalk and Maddie read, I think, pretty soon after the event. So it's just been sat on the shelves for a couple of years, and I thought, I'm in the mood for a thriller. So this is the story of 3 teenagers who were found in possession of one of their teacher's nudes. I don't know any more about the story other than that, and by now we've been introduced to all of the key players. So we have Jenna, who's the goth girl, who had her own nudes leaked just before the events of this book. Next is Mouse, a guy who has been paid a lot of money to create a system that collects girls' nudes in a sort of competition way and means that they can't be tracked back to the people that own them. And then we have Drew, who's the jock whose best friend was the one that leaked Jenna's nudes. And they've all been teamed up on this group project from the teacher whose nudes they eventually get. And their topic is on internet crimes, so they've decided to talk about the leaking and possession of nudes.
Also this week I managed to read Spellbook of the Lost and Found by Moira Fowley-Doyle, and there is quite a lot of characters in this to keep hold of. So there are 3 different perspectives. First, we're introduced to Olive and Rose, who are 2 best friends who wake up after a wild party, having lost a bunch of things and not knowing where they went missing. Then we have Hazel and her twin brother Rowan and her best friend Ivy. They have found a spellbook for lost things, and they cast the spell so that old things can start being returned. And finally, we have Laurel and Holly and Ash to make things even more complicated, and it's about how all of these people are connected. It doesn't help that they all have quite similar names, but it just added to the mysticism of it all. So it's split into sections where it tells you about the things that have gone lost, and then later on in the book those things turn up, but in a different girl's perspective. Something this book had a lot of was atmosphere. I always tried to read it in the evening because that's when it felt most appropriate, and I just loved the mysterious element of it tied with the magic, because usually I just read thrillers that can be explained rationally, so it was really fun to read something that was a little bit more out of the box. Another huge pro of this book is that there's so much queer representation. Olive and Rose are both bisexual main characters, and then Hazel is a lesbian, but then there's also your classic heterosexual love triangles happening in one storyline, so there's really something for everybody. I think it's one of those books where the plot is really hard to explain without spoiling it, but unfortunately I did actually know the big twist of this book before, because it was a book that Bea read for her dissertation, and so as she was doing that she was telling me about it, so I knew what was coming, but I thought it was just so clever how it all linked, and it's not necessarily something that you could put together, so the reader manages to do it at the same time as the characters rather than being one step ahead of each other, which I really liked. The last 50 pages where you finally figure out what's been going on the whole book was so rewarding. I managed to read it in like 15 minutes because I was just tearing through trying to find out what happened. So even though the whole spooky season is kind of getting away from us now, I would definitely put this on your TBRs for next year if you want to read it, or if you just want Halloween to last all year long, read it immediately because it's just that great.
I finished Easy Prey and I really enjoyed it, although I feel like it was kind of a snapshot in the middle of what is potentially a much larger story. I think it's because the ending manages to make one of these 3 main characters into the lead character of the whole story. I couldn't put this book down. Like, I wanted to know what happens next. The way that it's set into these little chunks, and you can see by the darker lines at the top, I was just reading to each of those and being like, how does this situation escalate from obtaining their teacher's number and then making that teacher then send them nudes? Like, how do they get there? The way that they were just so devious and like conniving in their plans together, whilst also you have this background hum of things happening in their own teenagers' lives, and even though they're working together, they're not really friends. You don't know whether they truly trust each other. Their lives are all entangled in complicated ways that means maybe a friendship isn't even possible between them. It's just a working partnership and they've all got their own agenda, and that comes out very much towards the end with the secrets that they're keeping and the decisions that they make that clearly aren't for the benefit of the group as a whole. There's no possible way to talk about it without spoiling the ending, so I'm just going to talk very briefly about that so you can skip forward 30 seconds or whatever. In the end, Jenna puts the fall on Drew and Mouse. She's able to pin this whole scheme on just the 2 of them extracting herself. And it's all in her own bid to get justice for what happened to her when her nudes were leaked by sort of not these 2 guys explicitly, but they were involved. Although she cuts down another woman, her teacher, in doing so, she wanted to highlight the problems of how they pushed her own case aside and made it seem like it was her fault that her nudes got leaked. But then when it's a teacher and like an older woman with a position of respect, that woman is posed as the victim. Jenna's annoyed that no one saw her as a victim in her own story, which she clearly was, but you're kind of left feeling unsettled because your judgment of whether the ending was right and just is based on your own personal morals. What she did has an element of wrongness to it, but then the boys were completely wrong in then wanting to keep all of these nudes that they were gathering. I think all of the characters are at fault in some sense. How satisfying the ending is for you depends on whose side you fall on. But I really enjoyed how the story built regardless of what the ending was. I felt it was structured perfectly, so I would give this 4 stars. And that's the end of this week's reading vlog. Thank you for watching and we'll see you next week. Suddenly